When it comes to the horror genre and the fans that occupy the landscape today, I find it to be an interesting topic to discuss. While the horror genre is one that has evolved from the occasional niche subgenre to whatever the next gimmick may be that's cheap enough and produces undeniable box office results. Psychological horror is one that has never really left the conversation. About a year ago, I did a video about the subgenre and the cliches that come with it. While there are hundreds of psychological horror films I would love to talk to you about today, I will be discussing a film that has not left my mind since I watched it back in 2018. That film is Hereditary, written and directed by Aster. Coming off of the critical success of his many shorts, Aster would eventually set out to do his first feature film. There's Something About the Johnsons and Beau, which eventually would be adapted into the 3-hour fantasy, are two standouts in his early filmography. It's very clear that Aster is drawn to the complicated and intricate relationships that are present within a family dynamic. Even Midsummer, his second feature film that tends to focus on the dynamics of a romantic relationship, is only put into motion following the family tragedy that our main character is enduring. I also find it funny that even though Hereditary was his first feature film, he's gone on the record now in multiple interviews saying that he intended for Beau is Afraid to be his directorial debut. But after meeting with multiple people and the project getting rejected, he would soon go on to write and direct Hereditary. Typically, when I'm discussing any film on my channel, I don't really go too in-depth on these. I do try to explore the essential themes and why I believe a film works or plays out the way that it does, but today I'm going all in. I will be doing a scene-by-scene analysis of the entirety of the film, with sources that come from the screenplay, internet articles, interviews with the man himself, Aster, and much more. After all, this may be the longest video that I work on, and after not posting for almost a year, I want to get back into this, so let's dive in. For the opening shot, we see this text on screen, and upon first viewing, this seems like it may just be some simple exposition, but having seen the film many times now, I refuse to believe that anything is so simple. While this does serve the purpose of giving us exposition that we would have to otherwise learn through character interactions and putting the pieces together with bits of dialogue, I find this cold open to be rather effective. It tells us a number of things that are incredibly useful to understanding the dynamics of the family's relationship and why specific characters are targeted more than others. In the text, we learn that Ellen, Annie's mother, has passed. It seems as though her father and her brother are both already dead as well. We also learn that Annie and her family, Stephen, Charlie, and Peter, are more than likely the characters we'll be focusing on for the rest of the film. The way the text is formatted gives us a sense of familiarity as well. It's not giving us the Blade Runner cold open that is meant to inform the audience of the way this world functions. Instead, it relies on us, as the viewers, understanding that this was more than likely an article that would have ran in the local newspaper obituary section. One thing I find interesting is that having read the script, this piece of text is actually nowhere to be found when you're reading it. So I assume this was a deliberate piece of information that was included at some point during the editing of the film. The first real shot that we get from the film is this long take that starts fixed on Charlie's treehouse and takes us on something of a small tour through Annie's workshop as it transitions into the opening scene with Peter and his father. The opening shot, being Charlie's treehouse, foreshadows the entirety of what is to come in the next 2 hours. There's also one thing to note about this shot. Considering the film has so much to do with cults and Aster seemingly hiding everything he can in his frames, I refuse to believe that anything is on screen by coincidence. The opening shot here with Charlie's treehouse contains the Rune of Life, camouflaged in a way to not draw attention to itself. This rune that we see kind of hidden in a way directly tells us that this is where Paimon will eventually be brought to life by the ending of the film. The way the rune sort of blends in to sort of look like the architecture of the treehouse doesn't draw attention to itself. In fact, I believe this sort of mirrors a lot of the cult's activities and schemes that play throughout the entirety of the film's runtime. The ominous music and the slightly askew camera angle helps drive this feeling of tension and anxiety within the film. As the camera begins to make its way through the rest of the workshop, we begin to gain an understanding of what Annie does. Unlike most horror films that tend to have the creepy dollhouse trope etched into the very nature of their existence, these houses or miniature models carry a different type of vigor to them. These aren't the typical type of dollhouses, if you could even call them that you tend to see in horror movies. No, these are intricately made miniatures that tend to carry meaning and purpose for Annie. They do tend to carry this connotation to them that they aren't meant to be played with, rather displayed in something like an exhibit, which we do learn is the exact purpose for later on. The scene then transitions, very impressively I might add, to this shot of Peter's room. While this transition may seem like something simple, I feel like there's another layer of tension added onto it. The fact that these are all miniature models Annie is creating and orchestrating on her own accord adds this sense of influence on another one's behalf. In other words, they feel like puppets on strings being controlled by an outside force of some kind, that being the cult that we see is revealed throughout the entirety of the film. This serves as very smart exposition that is able to really put us in the mindset of what this film is going to deliver. Peter's father gives him his suit to get dressed for Ellen's funeral and then proceeds to ask if he knows if Charlie slept in her room last night. It's here that we meet the rest of the family and understand the key roles that everyone is playing. We see Steve walking to Charlie's treehouse as the camera pans down, and we see Annie for the first time. She looks pretty upset, but that's to be expected considering they're literally on their way to her mother's funeral. It's immediately then that we meet Charlie, the youngest member of the family. The way Charlie is described in the script is very interesting and just solidifies the ideas that come with the film's outcome regarding gender and the host needed for Paimon to survive. In the script, Charlie is literally described as androgynous. Her name Charlie is also one that could easily be used interchangeably between men and women. Laying next to her is a small drawing pad and a shoebox which she quickly closes as for Steve to not see. Considering her fascination with small animals and her appeal that comes with dismembering them, it's more than likely there's something in that box that falls along those lines. Her knack to create things out of random objects could easily be interpreted as a parallel to the fact that Annie creates these miniatures. Perhaps the family sees this as a creative outlet and they don't think too much of it. This idea is supported by the fact that she has her own little makeshift desk in the left side of the frame here. Moving on to the next scene, we cut to Ellen's funeral. There's actually one thing in the script omitted from the film that mentions someone else delivering a eulogy in honor of Ellen to open the scene. The script describes this character as a large woman in her 60s. This really could be anyone, but if I were to guess who this is supposed to be, I'd assume it was meant to be Joan, who plays a much larger part in the film later on. In her speech, she goes on to say, quote, "Ellen was a tough one. She didn't mince words and she abhorred the sentimental and she was honest. And I know that's how she raised her children, Annie and Charles. May he rest in peace, to always be honest," end quote. The scene goes on to mention that a bird begins flapping its wings and startles the rest of the congregation. The bird, specifically a whippoorwill, fixes its gaze on Annie, which disturbs her before settling on a rafter. With a little bit of research, I was able to find that a whippoorwill is a North American bird with a very loud, distinct, and repetitive call. I would imagine this serves as a symbol for the cult members calling out Paimon's name or other words of practice during their rituals. In the actual final cut of the film, we cut directly to this image of Ellen, so none of the aforementioned text is seen on screen. Annie takes the stand to serve her mother's eulogy, and she mentions that it's nice to see such new faces. She goes on to say that her mother was a very private woman who took part in rituals and mostly dealt with her anxieties in a very private manner. As the camera pans around to reveal her face, we are able to see she is wearing this necklace that looks like a sigil. But if you go back to the frame where we first see Annie in the vehicle, she is not wearing the necklace. It's very well possible that her hair may be covering it, but this seems rather unlikely considering how much attention it tends to draw to itself. I feel like this either tells us that someone at the funeral, possibly one of the cult members, gave it to her or asked her to wear it in honor of her mother. As she continues to talk, we see the funeral continuing to take place. It's here that we see the sigil almost immediately again on Ellen's dead body. This time we're able to see it a bit more clearly. Having seen the film multiple times now and having done a bit of research, this is known as the Sigil of Paimon. It's also seen in this gold color contrasting the white clothing that she's wearing. At first glance, this may be to signify her royalty and leader of this cult, but it's actually more an honor on the part of Paimon himself. There is something of a backstory to be told with Paimon, so I'll try to be quick. The best information I was able to find regarding Paimon and everything surrounding him comes from a 17th century spellbook known as the Lesser Key of Solomon. This book has quite a bit of information in it regarding the names of up to 72 demons and instructions on how to summon them. The demons are classified into either a duke, a prince, marquis, knight, president, earl, or in the case of Paimon, a king. Every one of these demons carries their own sigil, which are to be made out of a specific type of metal according to their classifications. For kings, the sigil is to be made of gold. One thing to take note of as well is that the sigil Ellen and Annie are wearing are slightly different than the actual sigil. While the sigil of Paimon looks similar, there's noticeable differences. The upper half of the sigil contains 3 very similar patterns, whereas the actual sigil contains 4, but we'll come back to the relevance of this much later. It's within seconds that the scene continues on, and we see this subtle but effective moment play out. Charlie turns around to see what I assume to be a member of the cult giving her this creepy smile. I've seen many people interpret this moment in so many different ways, but the one that makes the most sense to me is that Charlie has actually been Paimon since birth. Let me explain this a little bit further. The film plays out with multiple mentions from Annie and Charlie both discussing these odd pieces of information that Ellen either said or did. For example, Charlie mentions that Ellen wanted her to be a boy. Annie even mentions at one point that she didn't let Ellen have anything to do with Peter, so when Charlie came around, she felt guilty, obligated to let her in her life. She even goes on to say that when she tried to feed her, Ellen would eventually go on to do it herself. It's here where I think Charlie was inhabited by Paimon, never really living a life of her own accord. It's never specified or draws attention to the film itself, but the film does kind of imply that she is on the spectrum in some way, shape, or form. Interestingly enough, when I was reading through the script, it does specifically state that Charlie is placed in a special needs classroom. I would imagine that this is more than likely a result of Paimon using her body as a host. While she is never fully conscious or aware of her actions, almost like she's in the backseat while Paimon drives. Aster also did mention in an interview with Variety a few years ago that Paimon has been living within Charlie since birth. So having this in mind, the man giving Charlie this creepy smile seems to add a bit more context, and if this was something that was Ellen's own doing, it's more than likely she informed the rest of the cult members of her own actions, and that Charlie's body is just a host for Paimon himself for the time being. This man isn't just some weird creep staring at Charlie because she's the next target. This man is first and foremost an admirer and worship of Paimon. As the scene continues on, we see the funeral proceeding and many of the cult members performing subtle but noticeable acts that the camera draws attention to, one of which being this cult member rubbing what looks like oil on Ellen's lips. There's a number of discussions online discussing what this could mean, but the one that stands out to me is the one that holds the most historical significance of pagan rituals. The religious practice of anointing the lips was meant to be seen as lubricant that would essentially ease the soul out of one's body. As far as the rest of the scene and how it plays out, I feel like the nut allergy isn't something significant to discuss, so let's move on. The next frame of the film cuts to the family coming home from the funeral. We see a shot inside of their home, and on the left side of the frame we once again see the rune of life subtly placed in something that doesn't draw attention to itself. The fact that the runes are placed in frame is no coincidence either, considering that the home the Grahams live in was specifically built for the film, and the exterior of the home was another location entirely. So these windows and the entire layout of the home are completely deliberate from the filmmakers themselves. Now, I've actually read a couple of theories saying that there are cult members quietly living within the home, and while I do completely believe this theory to be true, many people have also pointed out that you can actually hear their loud footsteps running in an effort to hide before the family comes in the door. And while that is possible, it's also very likely that the steps we hear may just be the Graham family making their way in and the shuffle of their footsteps are what we're hearing. I don't really find this likely though, as we do see a good look at the front door much later, and it seems to just be a slab of concrete that you wouldn't be able to hear through the door. The film moves on with small pieces of dialogue that, while I do think are great, don't carry much significance to everything that is to be revealed. Following the scene with Peter and his father, we get our first glance at Charlie's room. Once again, we see a small desk of trinkets and knickknacks that she's created. One thing that quickly catches my attention is that the shape and structure of her room looks identical to the treehouse. It's almost immediately after that Annie reassures her that Charlie was her favorite, telling us about the aforementioned line where Ellen insisted on feeding her. Charlie says that she wanted her to be a boy, and Annie doesn't think too much of this comment. She does her best to comfort her by telling her that she was also a tomboy growing up. Charlie then asks her who will take care of her once he's dead, and Annie is caught off guard by this and laughs it off as if it was nothing.
Excuse me, you don't think I'm gonna take care of you?
Again, this could all be seen as something odd, or Charlie just having poor communication skills, but if we think about these pieces of dialogue being said by Paimon himself, stuck in Charlie's body, it carries a completely different meaning. The simple but firm mentions that Ellen wanted him to be a boy, and him asking who will take care of him in such a frightened manner really solidifies this. After all, Ellen was really the only person in Charlie, or Paimon's life, who went out of her way to make him comfortable in his place here on Earth. It's only moments after this that Annie leans in to give Charlie a kiss goodnight and sees the word Satany written on her wall. In the scene immediately following this, Annie makes her way into the workshop, where she finds a note. In it is what seems to be an incredibly vague apology for something that may have happened in the past, but with the context of the rest of the film, I believe Ellen is apologizing for what she knows is actually coming for all of them. Leaving the note with, "Our sacrifice will pale next to the rewards," Annie begins to become anxious, unsure of what she means as she makes her way out of the office. As she makes her way out, Annie looks up and sees an apparition of her mother. This is something that clearly disturbs her because as she leaves, she decides to turn around one of her own created miniatures where we see the famous scenario that Annie had mentioned before, with her mother feeding Charlie. It's strange to think of why Annie would create something of such disturbance, but in a way this may just be a coping mechanism for her. Considering we do see this throughout the rest of the film in different ways as well, not only is it her job, but it is a very useful outlet for her emotions. We then cut to Charlie's classroom with a group of kids all varying in age. Charlie is supposed to be taking a quiz when her teacher catches her creating one of her little knickknacks and asking her to finish before playing with this. Charlie seems to be somewhat bothered, and then seconds later a bird slams into the window, breaking its own neck and dying in the bushes below it. Part of me thinks there may be some correlation between Charlie's mood and the bird immediately killing itself, but then we delve deeper into a territory that implies it's actually Paimon that did it. The entire time this sequence plays out, there's another sequence being intercut with Peter's day at school as well, which we'll come back to shortly. Charlie is obviously interested in the dead bird, so she goes to find it when they're outside. It's here that she cuts off its head with a pair of scissors that she found in the classroom. The entire time this is happening, a woman stands watching her across the street. One thing to note is that there is actually one small thing in the script that seemed to be left out of the final cut of the film. Moments after Charlie notices this older woman across the street, she sees Peter walking past her as he delivers the line, "No nuts, Charlie." Part of me thinks maybe Aster left this out of the final product because he trusted the audience to remember the already significant mention at Ellen's funeral.
Does that have nuts? Because we don't have the EpiPen.
Back to Peter's classroom, we hear what is essentially the central theme of the film being discussed in the context of another story. Peter is distracted by his classmate as they discuss the flaw of Heracles. She goes on to say that the flaw of Heracles is him refusing to look at all the signs of his inevitable doom the entirety of the play. The scene continues on as we hear small interactions from the classroom until another classmate chimes in, going on to say that it's more tragic. If it's inevitable, they're just all pawns in this larger game being controlled by an external force. We then cut to Annie in her workshop working on yet another miniature. Open on her computer is a webpage that has information on apparitions. This is a direct result of the night before, as Annie is unsure if she really saw her mother in the workshop that night. Not only that, but as the camera pans in her direction, we see that she's already creating a miniature of the exact thing she is doing at the moment. We hear a door open in the background only to hear Steve announce loudly that he's home. Annie gets up to meet him, walking down the hall, and sees her mother's old door open. She notices the door and slowly walks in only to find that the room is empty. We get a small glimpse of the room with some notable things in frame. First is this triangle that is etched onto the floor, and second are these two photos that sit on this dresser along the wall. My assumption is that the cult living within the home are the ones who opened the door. In the scene following, Steve is asked by Annie to lock Ellen's door. This is a sign that Annie's beginning to question her own sanity. Peter brings the phone to Steve and tells him the cemetery is calling. He walks away in this somewhat nonchalant manner to not draw attention to himself, as he continues talking to the person on the other side of the phone. They go on to say something that clearly alarms him as his eyes widen and then says the word desecrated. What does that mean? The film later does reveal that Ellen's body was taken from her grave. Annie then comes back, putting a coat over herself, asking Stephen what the call was about, to which he so gracefully lies as to not worry or upset her. Annie then does the same when she mentions she's going to see a movie, when in reality she's going to this grief recovery group. At this recovery group, we learn about Annie's past, which gives us quite a bit of insight into what may be happening for the first time. She goes on to say that her mother had DID and dementia. Her father died from starvation as a result of psychotic depression. Her brother Charles was a schizophrenic, hung himself in his bedroom, and then blamed Ellen in his suicide note for trying to put people inside of him. Annie talks about the situation with her family as though it's just another day for her. When she mentions her mother's condition, it seems as though they were pretty obvious signs to what she was doing within the cult, and Annie and Steve wrote it off as these rational conditions that elderly people tend to deal with, like dementia. As for her brother being schizophrenic, my guess is Ellen was trying to do everything she could to use his body as a host for payment. He must have caught on to what was happening and stopped it with his suicide before it could really come to fruition. After she delivers this monologue explaining her family, we cut to this next shot of the support group watching her. This is also the first time that we happen to see Joan on screen. Notice how she's placed on the left side of the frame so as to not draw attention to herself, and this is no mistake. Typically in movies, the shooting and editing process kind of goes hand in hand. Filmmakers make the deliberate choice to place certain things in the frame so that when we cut to the next shot, we don't have to focus elsewhere on screen. Our eyes just stay focused where we were last, but not here. The frame before this shows Annie centered in the frame, so when we cut to the next shot, the first person we're focused on is one of these two women. We don't even really notice Joan until we've studied the image for a moment. We then cut to the next scene with Peter smoking in his room when he goes to the window to blow out a puff of smoke. We see this shot with a cult member hidden in the shadows. You can see a puff of what looks like smoke on the left hand side here as well. It should also be noted that while the film never mentions it, the script says the story is to take place during the winter time, so it's more than likely just cold out, and this is his breath that we see. In the scene following, we are greeted with the shot of Charlie creating yet another one of the little toys. On the right hand side, we see this drawing of a bird which will come back later in the film. One thing to note is that Paimon takes on the form of a bird, which would also explain the clucking sound that Charlie makes throughout the film. We then see the will of Paimon grab her attention and summon to this field outside of the home. When I say grab her attention as well, it instantly almost puts her in a trance of sorts. We then see this shot of a number of Charlie's baby photos, and there's one in particular that stands out to me. We'll come back to this. She makes her way into this field where we see this overhead shot of Charlie walking in that direction. It's here where we see a number of footsteps, more than likely left behind by members of the cult watching the home at night. As this is happening, Peter begins to ask Annie if he can go to this party, where she then asks him to take Charlie with him. Charlie continues to make her way towards the field, and at first glance this looks like Ellen sitting around a fire performing a ritual of some sort. But the more I've thought about it, I think this is another cult member actually performing a ritual with Ellen's body. This would explain the charred remains of her burnt body that we find near the end of the film in the attic. In the script, this scene also plays out in a slightly different manner, and here it truly does solidify that Ellen's body is the one being used for a ritual. Here, they tied her to a post, stretching her arms out with planks, mimicking the crucifixion of Jesus. The scene reads as is. A ring of burning torches has been set up. Within this ring, an old woman's inanimate body, dead, stands erect, tied to a pole with her arms strapped to outstretched planks. The body is dressed in fine white silk. It looks like Ellen Lee, Charlie's grandmother, but it's too far away to quite tell.
Charlie!
Annie drags Charlie back into the house, demanding that she goes to this party with Peter. There's not really much here to analyze at all. Annie pretty much explains the reason for this herself, saying that now because Charlie has to go with him, he can't drink. Even then, Peter decides to get high, which is understandable as the feeling of disorientation and intoxication from both alcohol and marijuana are very different effects, and alcohol seems to be a much bigger issue for anyone who will be driving on the road. As he's driving to the party, we see a post with the sigil of Paimon etched into it, foreshadowing the death of Charlie in the moments to come. Peter and Charlie arrive at the party, and we see this group of girls baking a cake, and this girl chopping nuts like a psychopath. Peter finds the girl he has a crush on and goes to flirt with her, rather badly I might add. He cuts the small talk and shows her his weed, where she takes him upstairs to smoke with a group of friends, leaving Charlie to grab a piece of cake that would eventually cause her to have an allergic reaction. Peter and Bridget make their way upstairs, and if you look closely, her two friends are watching a video of someone being beheaded on a laptop. Charlie then almost immediately goes to find Peter and tells him that her throat is getting bigger, and they leave quickly. Charlie sticks her head out the window in a panic, trying to breathe as Peter swerves to avoid hitting a dead deer that's lying in the road, causing the side of the vehicle to hit a post. The foreshadowing of the same post earlier that was etched with the sigil of Paimon pays off right here. You can actually slow down the frame and see it on the right side being partially shown as Charlie's head comes clean off. The impact happens very fast, but for anybody watching it, it's quite obvious that Charlie has been beheaded. It takes a few moments for Peter to gather himself as he seems to be quite in shock. There's even a second where he glances at the rearview mirror, wondering what he'll see. I think this moment is insanely haunting, and it kind of thrives in this tension for the audience watching it as almost challenges you to keep watching. It makes you wonder, are they going to show it? Peter remains in shock, and after a moment just drives away. He arrives home and directly walks into his room, and if you listen closely you can hear Annie unsuspectingly mention how glad she is that they're safe and at home. The tension continues to build for the audience as we have to wait for Annie to find the lifeless and beheaded body of Charlie in the backseat of the car. It's almost immediately then after our question is answered and we see Charlie's head on the side of the highway covered in ants, which I will not show due to the graphic nature of the image. Following the film's release, fans and moviegoers pointed out that the situation in which Charlie loses her head is loosely based to an incident that really happened in 2004 in the town of Marietta, Georgia, which I live extremely close to. I was curious to see if I could find the exact location and possibly visit it myself, but there seems to be no specific information on this. I was able to find an article that details exactly what happened and is as follows. Police say 21-year-old John Kemper Hutcherson was driving drunk early Sunday morning when he hit a telephone pole support wire that decapitated Francis Daniel Brom as he leaned out the passenger window. Hutcherson then drove 12 miles to his suburban Atlanta home and slept in his bloody clothes, leaving the headless body in his truck. Aster has since stated that this true story and the events that take place in Hereditary have no real correlation and that it's all a mere coincidence. As the film continues, we see Charlie's burial and a small wake immediately after. The first image we see of this is a POV shot from the perspective of Peter, seeing it all through the stained glass that distorts the image. In the shot immediately following, Peter is seen standing directly behind the window that was mentioned earlier that shows the Rune of Life, foreshadowing Paimon taking his body as a host. We begin to get small glimmers of what life is like for the Graham family in the days following Charlie's death. One small scene from the film shows Steve walking into his empty bedroom where we're quickly shown a frame that contains the word Zazas written on the wall. There's not much to be said about this other than that Zazas is the name of another demon that can also be conjured, found in the Lesser Key of Solomon, which was mentioned before. Immediately after, we see a shot of Steven sitting in Charlie's room, grieving as he looks through her book of drawings. We see one in particular that was actually shown earlier in the film right before Charlie was forced to go to the party with Peter. Only when we saw it earlier, it did not have the crown. Considering that she was summoned to the field and then immediately forced to go to this party with Peter, it makes me wonder when she had time to put the finishing touches on this drawing, unless it was drawn at the hands of someone else, possibly a cult member that was living in the house. We then see a shot of Annie sleeping in Charlie's treehouse as we slowly crossfade into Peter's classroom. giving us this sense of impending doom and that Annie is being watched over by what or who would eventually become Paimon. Peter sits in class, still being haunted by the death of his sister, and we're able to catch a brief glimpse of her headless body lying in the back seat. He then looks down and sees the girl who he's had a crush on from earlier. Peter is then seen smoking with his friends under some bleachers, which seems common for him. Shortly after hitting a pipe, he begins to have what many people have interpreted as an anxiety attack. He then says he thinks that he's having an allergic reaction and that his throat is getting bigger. This is the exact thing Charlie said to him, which prompted them to leave so quickly from the party. It would make sense that he may be having an anxiety attack, considering he probably feels guilty due to his sister's death, being a direct result of what may have been his last interaction with marijuana prior to this. Annie then goes to her grief counseling group, and this is where she meets Joan for the first time. I mentioned earlier that there was a moment in the script omitted from the final cut of the film during the funeral scene in the opening. The unnamed woman who spoke of Ellen as though she was a dear friend, who I think may have been Joan. It's very well possible that it wasn't actually Joan and it was just some random cult member, but in the off chance that it was, I would assume that it was probably cut or even possibly never filmed, because this is the first interaction that Annie has with her and probably would have recognized her face from the funeral. It's also very well possible that the woman speaking at the funeral was a completely different person altogether. Joan goes on to say that it had been a few months since she had seen her, so it's been quite some time since her mother has passed. Joan asks if she's doing fine, only for Annie to mention that now her daughter has been killed, and then quickly realizes she misspoke, indirectly blaming Peter for the accident.
My daughter was killed.
Oh.
Joan then tells Annie about her son and grandson, hoping to break down the barrier between them, and gives Annie her phone number. In the following scene, Annie goes to Charlie's treehouse to sleep as Peter lies awake restless. He then begins to hear the clucking sound that Charlie used to make, and this startles him and reassures us as the audience that the spirit of Paimon still lingers in this home. The next scene in the film shows the Grahams' front door, specifically their mail slot. It's stacked with letters waiting for someone to come and collect them as someone comes by and slips in an ad for a seance happening nearby. Since the mail had already been delivered prior to this moment playing out, it tells us that this is more than likely one of the cult members, lingering around the house waiting for the perfect moment to strike and put this in their mail. They know that since Charlie is dead, as well as Ellen's recent passing, Annie is probably desperate for any sort of connection to them. Even if this doesn't really do anything now, it certainly plants the seeds for what is to come with Joan much later. We then see Annie in her office recreating Charlie's bedroom, even going as far as to write the word Satany on the wall, which was seen earlier in the film. She continues to work as she reaches for something, and this blue paint is knocked over on its own. It's understandable how she could write this off as an accident and her possibly being the one to knock it over, even though this was clearly done at the will of Paimon. It spills and she quickly attempts to clean it up. As she's doing this, she sees Joan's phone number and heads over to her apartment. When she arrives, she notices an embroidered doormat that reminds her of her mother. She even mentions it to Joan, who plays it off like it's nothing but mere coincidence. In terms of significance, all this scene really does is set the foundation for Annie to trust Joan much later down the line. As she's drinking the tea that Joan made for her, Annie pulls out a small piece of an herb and studies it carefully. This is known as the Dittany of Crete. Earlier in the film, right before Charlie's death, there was this moment where she was summoned to the field by the will of Paimon. There were a number of baby photos that we briefly see on screen. One in particular shows Ellen bottle feeding Charlie, only the bottle looks like there is something black inside lingering in the milk. My guess is that this is also the Dittany of Crete, and Ellen was using it to make Charlie susceptible to Paimon. Back to the scene with Annie, Joan tries to avoid getting caught and quickly changes the subject by asking about a vulnerable topic, Peter. Annie then goes on to tell Joan about a story where she covered Peter in paint thinner and he was woken up by the strike of a match. Stephen makes his way to Annie's workshop where he finds her making a miniature of the accident in which Charlie was decapitated. He clearly becomes angry, rightfully so, as she defends it as being a neutral view of the accident. The scene makes it pretty clear that if anyone is fighting for Peter in his own emotional turmoil, it's Steve, and he continues to do so for the remainder of the film. He tells Annie to come down to dinner, and we go on to receive probably the most powerful scene in the entire film. Considering how Steve left the room when he informed Annie that dinner was ready, it's quite indicative that she's pretty pissed off here as the scene begins. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure she's still incredibly torn up about the fact that Charlie is gone, but now she's got something of an attitude towards Stephen for saying what he did about her miniature shown before. I mentioned earlier that this is clearly one of the only ways that Annie is able to cope. I'm sure Stephen is probably aware of this considering they have been married for so long and all her work is done at home. It wouldn't be wild to think he's already seen some of the questionable miniatures she's already created, but regardless, this is the only time as an audience that we've seen him chastise her for it. Because of this, she is now visibly upset. Peter makes a comment about how good the food is and Stephen smiles. He understands that his son is probably having a really hard time working through this tragedy and is probably glad to see any communication from him. Annie then scoffs, which gets Peter's attention, causing his smile and enjoyment to immediately leave him. While so much can be said about the argument in this incredible monologue delivered by Toni Collette, there are a few things that grabbed my attention. As she's yelling at Peter, she delivers a line where she acknowledges that the entire situation was an accident. Only when she delivers this line, her head nods from left to right.
Well, now your sister is dead! And I know you miss her, and I know it was an accident, and I know you're in pain, and
This is interesting to me because even though she speaks apologetically, her body language doesn't truly believe this. This is supported by the fact that she told Joan earlier that Charlie was killed. Even if she misspoke, Annie truly feels like her daughter was deliberately killed by her son in an act of carelessness. Peter then calls out Annie by reminding her that Charlie didn't want to go to the party and was forced to by her. This changes Annie's entire demeanor here and is now something that will linger in her mind for a very long time. I also find this piece of dialogue rather interesting, more so that it came from Peter at this particular moment. I do believe that while Peter probably felt incredibly guilty and responsible for the death of his sister, he must have found some way to rationalize what had happened. That rationalization being that Annie forced Charlie to go, and something he had been holding on to for a long time. If anything, I'd imagine that Peter also didn't want to place that burden of guilt or responsibility on his mother, so he kept it to himself until just the right time. Annie later sees Joan when she's getting art supplies and tells her about the seance that she attended. At first, Annie is rather hesitant, and Joan continues to try and convince her that it'll work, knowing that she is desperate for anything to do with Charlie and communicating with her. You can even see the chalkboards in her trunk as she is talking to Annie about this whole situation. They both go back to Joan's apartment and conduct a seance. Annie is hesitant at first, but quickly begins to believe this as a result of the chalkboard writing on itself. She begins to freak out and wants to leave, but this isn't before Joan is able to pull out a pamphlet telling her how to conduct the seance herself. If we slow down this moment frame by frame, we can clearly see what looks to be another sigil on the cover, which is very similar to the one of Paimons. Joan tries to calm down Annie. As she does this, she's sure to try and maintain eye contact with her as she tries to look away the entire time. She goes on to say that every member of her family needs to be in the house, but only mentions Peter.
Your whole family, every member needs to be in the house. Your son, everyone. Very important.
Annie is already struggling pretty hard to maintain herself through this entire situation, so she finally makes her way to the door. But not before Joan blurts out one more line that will essentially be the driving force for Annie to conduct the seance on her own.
You didn't kill her, Annie.
In one of the scenes shortly prior to this, I mentioned a piece of dialogue that stuck out to me from Peter. During the dinner table scene where Annie chastises Peter for not taking responsibility for anything, he goes out of the way to flip the cards on her and tells her that Charlie did not want to go to the party, and that if she was there, it was a product of Annie's actions. Ever since that dinner took place, Annie has felt responsible for what happened because that idea has now been planted in her head. Not only that, but the fact that she told Joan her daughter was killed adds much more of a layer to this. Annie really does feel like Charlie's death was her fault now, and the cult members that are quietly living amongst the home more than likely heard the argument happening, informing Joan and telling her about the argument that had taken place. She takes advantage of it by saying the one thing that should have gotten her attention.
You didn't kill her, Annie. What? She isn't gone.
On her drive back home, Annie hears a cluck like the one Charlie used to make and begins to cry. In the scene following, Annie lies restlessly in bed. She tosses and turns, eventually turning around to see ants walking along her pillow. She looks up only to find a trail of them coming from Peter's room. One thing to take note of is yet another window that bears the rune of life once more. Annie creeps slowly into Peter's room and sees a trail of ants leading to his face, covering it almost entirely. This is reflective of Charlie's severed head lying on the side of the road much earlier in the film. Annie's mouth opens as she holds back before she screams until Peter breaks the silence in the room, asking her what she is doing there. Annie goes on to say that she tried to abort Peter when she was pregnant. Seconds later, Peter is soaked in what I could only assume to be paint thinner, considering the story that Annie had mentioned to Joan much earlier. A fire erupts in front of Annie, who also looks to be soaking, and then suddenly she wakes up. After waking up, Annie more than likely reads this as a sign to conduct a seance as she wakes up Peter and Steven. They make their way downstairs and begin to conduct the ritual. Once Annie explains what she sets out to do, Steven writes it off as Annie being ridiculous, where she then proceeds to tell them that she is a medium and has been seeing apparitions. It's important to note that she is saying apparitions plural. As an audience, the only apparition that were shown from her perspective was her mother in the workshop towards the beginning of the film. If there were more apparitions that she has seen, they were more than likely done off screen. Regardless, it doesn't change the fact that Steve is hesitant and doesn't place his faith in something like this. He also seems to be more concerned with Peter's well-being here, as he looks to him for confirmation before agreeing to anything. Peter agrees to stay as he hears the desperation and pleading in his mother's voice. During the seance, Peter is the first person in the room to notice any sort of shift in energy. He acknowledges that he can feel something, but can't quite place his finger on it at first, only to end up saying that the air is flexing. It's quite apparent that Peter is the only one to notice it here, as he is essentially the next subject the cult aims to target as Paymon's host. After a moment, the glass moves, and the only person who isn't fazed by this is Annie. Peter begins to breathe heavily, as I believe this may be the first time Paymon enters his body. In the case of Peter's body being inhabited here, I find it kind of different from Charlie's body being used earlier in the film. Due to the fact that Peter has been fully conscious and lived a life with no prior influence from an outside force, it's more than likely this feels like a slower transition for him. Since Charlie's life had been influenced since birth, her experience with her body being inhabited would have been quite different. This scene could very well have been interpreted as Peter also just freaking out and not understanding the power of what's happening. But the sudden and intense change in demeanor makes me believe that he is slowly losing his body to the will of Paymon. Another thing to note is that when this is happening, the shot is framed so that Peter is standing directly in front of the window that has the Rune of Life on it. The scene continues on and tensions begin to rise. Peter begins freaking out as he begins to notice a shift in his own consciousness. Perhaps he's aware that what is happening is not normal, but doesn't quite know how to put his finger on what's happening. After the flame erupts before their eyes, Annie begins to speak, but instead we hear the voice of Charlie. One thing I find quite interesting is that even though as the audience we know it's Charlie's voice, there is something slightly different about her speech patterns and how we hear it. If you pay attention to her voice much earlier in the film, it seems to sound slightly different than it does now. Charlie's voice is much more quiet, and she seems to carry some sort of speech impediment, often mumbling her words, making it hard to understand her. But when we hear her voice now, it's loud and clear. It's very well possible that this may be the first time Charlie's voice is really heard, without any influence from Paymon himself. One more layer that I feel is added to this is that all of this is happening as a result of the seance. Paymon, now inhabiting or transitioning into Peter's body, is almost taunting and feeding on the desperation of the Graham family. It's almost like he's taken the soul of Charlie as a hostage and is passing her the phone to show the family there's still hope, even though she's very well dead. Steve then throws a cup of water in Annie's face, waking her up from the trance, and consoles Peter. In the next few frames, we see the words Liftoach and Pandemonium written on a wall somewhere in the household. Based on the wallpaper and the patterns we see, this is indicative to be somewhere in the hallway below the attic, as we are able to see in this shot. As for the translations, the word Liftoach is Hebrew, meaning open, while the word Pandemonium is often referred to in literature as the capital city of hell, more specifically John Milton's epic poem Paradise Lost. The word actually derives from the Greek pan, meaning all, or every, and dominion, a diminutive form meaning little spirit, or as Christians interpreted as little daemon, and much later, demon. This being shown on screen before we enter the final act is indicative that from this point going further, there is no return for any of our characters. This is also the last time we see anything written or etched into a wall on screen throughout the remainder of the film. Interestingly enough, I know for a lot of people words that are written and scattered throughout the film probably means nothing to them. But as someone who studied the film and taken notes, I find them quite interesting. Not only do they give us a bit of insight into how the next few scenes will play out, but it lets us as an audience know this story conforms to the 3-act structure format and where we are in the story's narrative. The first time we see this is very early in the film, in Charlie's bedroom, about 9 minutes into the movie. The second time we see it is about 45 minutes into the film, and finally the last time we see it is about the hour and 20-minute mark. Entering the third and final act of the film, we see this shot of Peter sitting at the edge of his bed in somewhat of a daze. He looks almost lifeless, which would make sense for what is currently happening to him. We then see this match cut of him sitting in class, quite literally still locked into this daze he's stuck in, until he notices this blue light that is indicative of the will of Paymon once again. It draws his attention as he follows it to the back of the room and quickly notices his reflection on a piece of glass. He's confused because even though it is his reflection, he clearly doesn't see himself looking back at him. It is Paymon's. He's then startled by the clucking noise once again, causing him to stand up quickly. He plays it off like he needs to go to the bathroom while he uses this time to calm himself down. Steven calls Annie to tell her that Peter has called him and that he's not doing well mentally. He phrases it by asking Annie if she can guess who called him, only for her to say Charlie. The phone call continues on, but there's nothing relevant here that I can't imagine can't be figured out on one's own. We then hear this phone call from the art exhibit that was planning to display Annie's miniatures, which is funny enough actually the voice of the director Aster himself. This seems to be the final straw for Annie, causing her to destroy all of her own creations, with the exception of a few in particular: Ellen breastfeeding Charlie and Peter's headless corpse. When Steven asks Annie why she destroyed everything, everything, she says she didn't feel like looking at it anymore. In all reality, I believe Annie has now come to the realization that everything is out of her hands. Don't get me wrong, I never do think anything is really within her control, but I'm sure she must have felt that way. Being someone who creates miniatures on such a grand and countless scale, it must have given her some sense of mastery. Now that everything is becoming quite unpredictable and she's lost this sense of self-control, she feels this is all meaningless and doesn't want to continue. In the scene immediately following, we see this moment where Annie walks into Charlie's room and sees her old drawing pad. It begins to draw what looks like a face and then cuts away to this shot of the hallway that is specifically aimed at the attic. We cut to Peter's room lying in bed at night. Take notice of his door being closed. He slowly wakes up for a moment where he sees Charlie in the dark corner of the room. He begins to look up very carefully, only for her head to fall and transform into a basketball. His attention is then drawn to the previously shut door, and the scared dog now standing in the doorway. We see this pair of hands trying to behead Peter and immediately cut to Steve sleeping on the couch. This is more than likely a result of the strain that's been put on his marriage and the inability to get through to Annie. We cut back to Annie and Peter arguing in his room as Peter yells at her for trying to pull his head off. He mentions he saw Charlie in the room and Annie is desperate to know where, as well as begging him not to tell Steve of what he's saying. We then cut back to Charlie's room where we are able to finally see the drawing that was being done earlier was actually a lifeless Peter. It's important to note that the only indication of this is with these X's drawn on his eyes. This could possibly mean that while Peter's body may still be alive, it's being inhabited by Paimon. There is the old saying that the eyes are the window to the soul, so what this may be saying here is that Peter's eyes are no longer a window to his soul, but Paimon's. After seeing this, it's clear that Annie realizes she made a mistake, and is now doing her best to reverse or stop everything she's done. Considering what Joan told her about needing a link to Charlie during the seance, my assumption is now that Annie now sees the drawing pad as something of a conduit or a cursed object. Scared and unsure of what to do, Annie decides to throw Charlie's drawing pad in the fire, thinking this will essentially close the door to this evil that's been unleashed and terrorizing the family. Now, when it comes to this world of demonology, I'm no expert, but I've seen my fair share of the Conjuring films, and by fair share I mean literally every installment. I actually own all of them. But in the first film, we actually have a scene with Patrick Wilson's character where someone asks him why he wouldn't destroy all of these cursed objects in a room that he has. He goes on to explain that the objects these demons are attached to are the only thing that keeps them from wreaking havoc, using an analogy that sometimes keeping the genie in the bottle is safest. Having this in mind, it makes me wonder why Annie would try to do this, but I suppose I can't assume that she has also seen The Conjuring or known quite literally anything surrounding this particular subject. Regardless, she tries to burn the book only to notice her arm is now slowly catching on fire. This leads her to believe that her and the book are now linked in a way. I actually don't believe that she and the book are linked, but rather that this is a trick being played by Paimon. At this point, the ritual that was performed earlier has opened the door to the entire home, and this book is mostly meaningless. The drawings themselves of Peter were being produced before her very eyes as a way of taunting her. If anything, I could see Paimon burning her in association with the book to try and make her think there is a link, and use this against her much later. Annie then goes to Joan's apartment where we see a number of things. Firstly, Joan does not answer, and if you look closely when Annie is knocking on her door, we can clearly see that Joan is the only one with a security camera pointed at her apartment. This probably doesn't carry much meaning other than the fact that Joan likes to be somewhat cautious since she's in the middle of conducting the induction of one of the 8 Kings of Hell. We then get a look inside and notice Peter's photo is placed on something indicating of a ritual. The table also contains the same triangle that was seen in Ellen's room earlier in the film, indicating to us that Ellen was more than likely also conducting her own rituals within the Graham family home. Charlie's toys are all set on Joan's table in a manner that serves as a parallel to the cult members bowing before Paimon at the end of the film. It's important to note the object of choice in place of Paimon is the one with the bird being used as its head. This is also the same toy that was created from the severed bird head earlier in the film. Joan more than likely got these from Annie's home as cult members were living there. After a moment, Annie looks down and quickly realizes why Joan's embroidered doormat looks so similar and rushes home. We cut to Peter at school where he still seems to be stuck in this trance. Joan stands across the street and catches his attention as she yells out what seems to be another ritual, this time trying to cast out Peter's soul from his own body. She yells out the words Satany, Degony, and a paragon. There aren't many concrete answers online of what these words really mean. Some sources mention that these words are meant to be part of a ritual often used in necromancy in order to banish a demon. only this time she's actually getting rid of Peter's soul or consciousness for Paimon to take over. Based on her saying that she expels Peter at the end and noticing the sudden change in his demeanor, I would assume that is exactly what is being done. Annie then rushes into her office and finds a box with her mother's belongings, and finds the doormats with the embroidery on it. She first finds hers and then her brother's Charles. If we take a look at Annie's first, there's one thing of relevance right off the bat. There is this compass with the northwest direction colored differently. We then see the one with Charles's name on it and are able to quickly notice the sigil of Paimon along with this triangle-shaped pattern that looks similar to the one seen in Ellen's room and Joan's table with the ritual. Annie then moves on to the next box and notices a book with the sigil of Paimon on the cover. Unable to read it, she moves on to the next one titled Invocations. It's here that we're shown the first drawing or iteration of Paimon in literature on screen, and it's more than likely how Ellen got her education on leading the cult. First thing to take notice of is the compass with an arrow pointing to the northwest. He also seems to be holding the staff that looks indicative of a hand pointing, which we will see from Peter in his classroom in the moments following. One final thing I would like to point out are the 3 heads that are hung at the bottom of this camel. This is all meant to come to fruition by the end of the film as Paimon takes his host, and by the end we see this come true as Ellen, Charlie, and Annie all end up decapitated by the end of the film. We see brief glimpses of the text that give us little but useful insight to understanding the basic plot of the film. As Annie shuffles through the rest of the box, we see a small bottle slightly out of focus with a label that reads Dittany of Crete, which was mentioned earlier in the video. She then finds the photo album and realizes that all of this was connected, noticing that Joan is in many of the photos as well as the sigil of Paimon. We then cut back to Peter at school as he notices the will of Paimon once again as he makes his way to class. All the while this is happening, Annie slowly makes her way to the attic, finding her mother's headless body as well as Paimon's sigil drawn in blood. We cut back to Peter at school where Paimon decides to attack. This hand gesture we see Peter doing is a reference to the illustration of Paimon we saw minutes earlier. Steve brings Peter home from school when he quickly notices the smell of Ellen's body. Annie begs him to go upstairs and see it for himself, and while he does this, she runs to the fireplace and prepares to burn the book. She attempts to convince him of everything that is actually happening to the family and why these strange incidents have been taking place, only she mentions to him that she can and will stop it, which as we all know is not possible. Steve has become weary and exhausted by all of this, blaming her for digging up Ellen's grave. She begs him to throw Charlie's book in the fire, believing it to be a conduit and that it will save Peter, sacrificing herself in the process. Even if he isn't aware as to why, she truly believes that her and the book are linked. If the book goes, so does she. I assume that she wants Steven to do it because now that she knows, or thinks, that she and the book are linked, that she wouldn't be able to do it herself. Not in the literal sense, of course, but more emotionally and willing to do it. At this point, it almost feels like she's pointing a gun to her own head and can't bring herself to pull the trigger, especially not with her own husband standing in front of her as she professes her love to him for what she believes will be her final time. Steven nearly throws the book in the fire, like he is literally moments away, but his therapeutic side comes out of him telling her that it isn't healthy to continue indulging her. Annie then decides to sacrifice herself by throwing the book in the fire, only to turn around and see Steven engulfed in flames. Annie begins to cry hysterically as we then see the will of Paimon take over her almost immediately and becoming unfazed. As for what happens next in the film, there's not much to analyze as this final sequence is essentially putting the final touches on an already incredibly layered film. Peter finds his dad's body as Annie follows him throughout the home and attacks him. Peter sees one of the cult members and runs to the attic where he sees a ritual with his photo being used. He believes he is dreaming and attempts to wake himself up, and he looks up only to see his mother slicing her own head off using what looks like a piano cord. He then jumps out the window and Annie's head can be heard hitting the floor seconds later. You can actually see Annie's shadow floating above Peter's body as the will of Paimon then makes its way out of Annie and into Peter, where he will then walk directly to the treehouse following a headless Annie. After making his way into the treehouse, we see a number of cult members bowing to a golden statue, with Charlie's head also has a staff that is identical to the one we see in the illustration of Paimon earlier. In the other hand, there are 3 fingers being held up as an indication that there have now been 3 sacrifices made in his name. Peter looks around the room and sees a headless Annie and Ellen bowing to the statue. Peter stands still as he is crowned Paimon. We hear Joan's voice conducting the ceremony and an image of Ellen that says Queen Lee. Joan puts the crown on Peter and names him Paimon. this marks the end of the film. Now do keep in mind what I've said in this video is not completely factual, and there may be room to reinterpret what I was able to gather. While I've seen the film many times and taken many notes on these occasions, a lot of the information I've gathered were from online forums, discussions with friends, and putting clues together that I found after my numerous viewings. If you felt this video was informative, or even just want to see more content like this on my page, make sure to leave a like, comment, don't forget to subscribe. I know it had been a long time since I posted anything, as I took a break from working on a short film and I am now in preparation to do a second. I don't want to leave this part of my life behind, as I do really enjoy writing and analyzing films on a very deep and fundamental level. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.